was now 7 o'clock, and I would have liked nothing better than to go home and have my girlfriend Debbie cook me a nice, delicious dinner. But for the last several years, our financial circumstances have forced Debbie to work 3 nights a week as a waitress. After all, somebody had to bring in a little money. So I was on my own. But the worst thing of all was that I'd been trapped by an odd series of circumstances into agreeing to have dinner with a man I'd been avoiding literally for years. His name was Andre Gregory. At one time, he'd been a very close friend of mine, as well as my most valued colleague in the theater. In fact, he was the man who had first discovered me and put one of my plays on the professional stage. When I'd known Andre, he'd been at the height of his career as a theater director. The amazing work he did with his company, the Manhattan Project, had just stunned audiences throughout the world. But then, something had happened to Andre. He dropped out of the theater. He'd sort of disappeared. For months at a time, his family seemed only to know that he was traveling in some odd place like Tibet, which was really weird because he loved his wife and children. He never used to like to leave home at all. Or else you'd hear that someone had met him at a party and he'd been telling people that he talked with trees or something like that. Obviously, something terrible had happened to Andre.
I'd stay back and
Finally, I got around to asking him what he'd been up to in the last few years.
I'm just dying to hear it. Really?
At first, he seemed a little reluctant to go into it. So I just kept asking, and finally he started to answer.
Conference on para-theatrical work then. And this must have been about 5 years ago. And Grotowski and I were walking along Fifth Avenue, and we were talking. See, he'd invited me to come to teach that summer in Poland, you know, to teach a workshop to actors and directors and whatever. And I told him that I didn't want to come because really I had nothing left to teach. I had nothing left to say. I didn't know anything. I couldn't teach anything. Exercises meant nothing to me anymore. Working on scenes from plays seemed ridiculous. I didn't know what to do. I mean, I just couldn't do it. So he said, why don't you tell me anything you'd like to have if you did a workshop for me, no matter how outrageous, and maybe I can give it to you. So I said, well, if you could give me 40 Jewish women who speak neither English nor French, either women who've been in the theater for a long time and want to leave it but don't know why, or young women who love the theater but have never seen a theater they could love, and if these women could play the trumpet or the harp, and if I could work in a forest, I'd come. A week later, or 2 weeks later, he called me from Poland and he said, well, 40 Jewish women is a little hard to find. But he said, I do have 40 women. They all pretty much fit the definition. And he said, I also have some very interesting men, but you don't have to work with them. These are all people who have in common the fact that they're questioning the theater. They don't all play the trumpet or the harp, but they all play a musical instrument, and none of them speak English. And he'd found me a forest wally. And the only inhabitants of this forest were some wild boar and a hermit. So that was an offer I couldn't refuse. I had to go. So I went to Poland, this wonderful group of young men and women. And the forest he had found us was absolutely magical. You know, it was a huge forest. I mean, the trees were so large that 4 or 5 people linking their arms couldn't get their arms around the trees. And so we were camped out beside the ruins of this tiny little castle, and we would eat around this great stone slab that served as a sort of a table. And our schedule was that usually we'd start work around sunset, and then generally we'd work until about 6 or 7 in the morning, and then, because the Poles loved to sing and dance, we'd sing and dance until about 10 or 11 in the morning, and then we'd have our food, which was generally bread, jam, cheese, and tea, and then we'd sleep from around noon to sunset. Now, technically, of course, the situation is a very interesting one. Because if you find yourself in a forest with a group of 40 people who don't speak your language, then all your moorings are gone.
What do you mean exactly?
Well, what we do is just sit there and wait for someone to have an impulse to do something. Now, in a way, that's something like a theatrical improvisation. I mean, you know, if you were a director working on a play by Chekhov, you might have the actors playing the mother, the son, or the uncle all sit around in a room and do a made-up scene that isn't in the play. For instance, you might say to them, all right, let's say that it's a rainy Sunday afternoon on Soren's estate, and you're all trapped in the drawing room together. And then everyone would improvise, saying and doing what their character might say and do in that circumstance. Except that in this type of improvisation, the kind we did in Poland, The theme is oneself. So you follow the same law of improvisation, which is that you do whatever your impulse as the character tells you to do. But in this case, you're the character. So there's no imaginary situation to hide behind, and there's no other person to hide behind. What you're doing, in fact, is you're asking those same questions that Stanislavski said the actor should constantly ask himself as a character. Who am I? Why am I here? Where do I come from? And where am I going? But instead of applying them to a role, you apply them to yourself. Or to look at it a little differently, in a way it's like going right back to childhood, where a group of children simply come into a room or brought into a room without toys and begin to play. Grown-ups were learning how to play again.
So you would all sit together somewhere and you would play in some way, but what would you actually do?
Well, I could give you a good example. You see, we worked together for a week in the city before we went off to our forest. And of course, Grotowski was there in the city too. And I heard that every night he conducted something called a beehive. And I loved the sound of this beehive. So a night or two before we were supposed to go off to the country, I grabbed him by the collar and I said, listen, about this beehive, you know, I'd kind of like to participate in one. Just instinctively, I feel it would be something interesting. And he said, well, certainly. In fact, why don't you with your group lead the beehive instead of participating in one, you know? I got very nervous, you know, and I said, well, what is a beehive? He said, well, a beehive is, at 8 o'clock, 100 strangers come into a room. I said, yes. He said, yes, and whatever happens is a beehive. And I said, yes, but what am I supposed to do? He said, that's up to you. I said, no, I really don't want to do this. I'll just participate. And he said, no, you lead the beehive. Well, I was terrified, Wally. I mean, in a way, I felt on stage. I did it anyway.
God, well, tell me about it.
You see, there was this song. I have a tape of it. I can play it for you one day. And it's just unbelievably beautiful. You see, one of the women in our group knew a few fragments of this song of St. Francis, and it's a song in which you thank God for your eyes, and you thank God for your heart, and you thank God for your friends, and you thank God for your life, and it repeats itself over and over again. And this became our theme song. I really must play this thing for you one day because you just can't believe that a group of people who don't know how to sing could create something so beautiful. So I decided that when the people arrived for the beehive, that our group would already be there singing this very beautiful song, and that we would simply sing it over and over again. One of the people decided to bring her very large teddy bear. You know, I was a little afraid of this event, and somebody wanted to bring a sheet, and somebody else wanted to bring a large bowl of water in case people got hot or thirsty. And somebody suggested that we have candles, that there be no artificial light, but candlelight. And I remember watching people preparing for this evening. Of course, there was no makeup and there were no costumes, but it was exactly the way that people prepare for a performance. You know, people were sort of taking off their jewelry and their watches and stowing it away and making sure it's all secure. And then slowly, people arrived, the way they would arrive at the theater, in ones and twos and tens and 15s and what have you. And we were just sitting there and we were singing this very beautiful song, and people started to sit with us and started to learn the song. Now, there is, of course, as in any performance or improvisation, an instinct for when things are going to get boring. So at a certain point, although it may have taken an hour to get there, an hour and a half, I suddenly grabbed this teddy bear and threw it in the air, at which 140 or 30 people suddenly exploded. You know, it was like a Jackson Pollock painting. You know, human beings exploded out of this tight little circle that was singing a song, and before I knew it, there were two circles dancing, you know, one dancing clockwise, the other dancing counterclockwise, with this rhythm mostly from the waist down. In other words, like an American Indian dance with this thumping, persistent rhythm. Now, you can easily see, because we're talking about group trance, where the line between something like this and something like Hitler's Nuremberg rallies is, in a way, a very thin line. Anyway, after about an hour of this wild, hypnotic dancing, Grotowski and I found ourselves sitting opposite each other in the middle of this whole thing, and we threw the teddy bear back and forth. You know, on one level, you could say this is childish. And I gave the teddy bear suck suddenly at my breast, and then I threw the teddy bear to him, and he gave it suck at his breast, and then the teddy bear was thrown up into the air again, at which there was another explosion of form into something. And you see, what was it like? You know, there's something like a kaleidoscope, like a human kaleidoscope. The evening was made up of shiftings of the kaleidoscope. Now, the only other things that I remember, other than constantly trying to guide this thing, which was always involved with either movement, rhythm, repetition, or song, or chanting, because 2 people in my group had brought musical instruments, a flute and a drum, which of course is sacred instruments, was that sometimes the room would break up into 6 or 7 different things going on at once, you know, 6 or 7 different improvisations, all of which seemed in some way related to each other. It was like a magnificent cobweb. And at one point, I noticed that Grotowski was at the center of one group, huddled around a bunch of candles that they gathered together. And like a little child fascinated by fire, I saw that he had his hand right in the flame and was holding it there. And as I approached his group, I wondered if I could do it. I put my left hand in the flame, and I found I could hold it there for as long as I liked, and there was no burn and no pain. But when I tried to put my right hand in the flame, I couldn't hold it there for a second. So Grotowski said, if it burns, try to change some little thing in yourself. And I tried to do that. Didn't work. And then I remember a very, very beautiful procession with the sheet, and there was somebody being carried below the sheet. You know, the sheet was like some great biblical canopy, and the entire group was weaving around the room and chanting. And then at one point, people were dancing, and I was dancing with a girl, and suddenly our hands began vibrating near each other like this, vibrating, and we went down to our knees, and suddenly I was sobbing in her arms, and she was sort of cradling me in her arms, and then she started to cry too, and then we just hugged each other for a moment, and then we joined the dance again. And then at a certain point, hours later, we returned to the singing of the Song of St. Francis, and that was the end of the Beehive. And then again, when it was over, it was just like the theater after a performance. You know, people sort of put on their earrings and their wristwatches, and we went off to the railroad station to drink a lot of beer and have a good dinner. Oh, and there was one girl who wasn't in our group, but who just wouldn't leave. So we took her along with us.
God. Well, tell me some of the other things you did with your group.
Well, I remember once when we were in the city, we tried doing an improvisation, you know, the kind that I used to do in New York. Everybody's supposed to be on an airplane, and they've all learned from the pilot there's something wrong with the motor. But what was unusual about this improvisation was that 2 people who participated in it fell in love. You know, they've in fact married. And when we went, out of fear of being on this plane, they fell in love, thinking they were going to die at any moment. And when we went to the forest, these 2 disappeared because they understood the experiment so well that they realized that to go off together in the forest was much more important than any kind of experiment the group could do as a whole. So about halfway through the week, we stumbled into a clearing in the forest, and the 2 of them were fast asleep in each other's arms. It was around dawn, and we put flowers on them to let them know we'd been there, and then we crept away. And then on the last day of our stay in the forest, these 2 showed up, and they shook me by my hands, and they thanked me very much for the wonderful work they've been able to do, you see. So, they understood what it was about. I mean, that, of course, poses the question of what was it about, but it has something to do with living. And then on the final day of our stay in the forest, the whole group did something so wonderful for me, Wally. They arranged a christening, a baptism for me, and they filled the castle with flowers, and it was just a miracle of light because they had literally set up hundreds of candles and torches. I mean, no church could have looked more beautiful. There was a simple ceremony, and one of them played the role of my godmother, and another played the role of my godfather, and I was given a new name. They called me Yendrush. And some of the people took it completely seriously, and some of them found it funny, but I really felt that I had a new name. And then we had an enormous feast with blueberries picked from the field, and chocolate someone had gone a great distance to buy, and raspberry soup, rabbit stew, and we sang Polish songs and Greek songs, and everybody danced for the rest of the night. Well, I have a picture. See, this was, let's see. Oh yeah, this was me in the forest. See? That's what I felt like. That's the state I was in.
God. Yeah, I remember George told me he'd seen you around that time. He said you looked like you'd come back from a war.
Yeah, I remember meeting him. He asked me a lot of friendly questions. I think I called you up too that summer, didn't I?
Huh. I think I was out of town.
Yeah, well, most people I met thought there was something wrong with me. They didn't say that, but I could tell that that was what they thought. But, see, what I think I experienced was, for the first time in my life, to know what it means to be truly alive. Now, that's very frightening, because with that comes an immediate awareness of death, because they go hand in hand. You know, the kind of impulse that led to Walt Whitman, that led to Leaves of Grass. You know, that feeling of being connected to everything means to also be connected to death. And that's pretty scary. But I really felt as if I were floating above the ground, not walking, you know, and I could do things like go out to the highway and watch the lights go from red to green and think, how wonderful. And then one day in the early fall, I was out in the country walking in a field, and I suddenly heard a voice say Little Prince. Of course, The Little Prince was a book that I always thought of as disgusting childish treacle, but still I thought, well, you know, if a voice comes to me in a field, I mean, this was the first voice I had ever heard. Maybe I should go and read the book. Now, that same morning, I got a letter from a young woman who'd been in my group in Poland, and in her letter, she'd written, "You have dominated me." You know, she spoke very awkward English, so she'd gone to the dictionary and she crossed out the word dominated, and she said, no, the correct word is tamed. And then when I went to town and bought the book and started to read it, I saw that taming was the most important word in the whole book. By the end of the book, I was in tears. I was so moved by the story. And then I went and tried to write an answer to a letter, because she'd written me a very long letter, but I just couldn't find the right words. So finally, I took my hand, I put it on a piece of paper, I outlined it with a pen, and I wrote in the center something like, "Your heart is in my hand," something like that. And then I went over to my brother's house to swim, because he lives nearby in the country, and he has a pool, and he wasn't home. I went into his library, and he had bought at an auction the collected issues of Minotaur. You know, the Surrealist magazine? Oh, it was a great, great Surrealist magazine in the 20s and 30s. And I never, you know, I consider myself a bit of a Surrealist. I had never, ever seen a copy of Minotaur. And here they all were, bound year after year. So, at random, I picked one out, I opened it up, and there was a full-page reproduction of the letter A from Tenniel's Alice in Wonderland. And I thought that, well, you know, it's been a day of coincidence, but that's not unusual that the Surrealists would have been interested in Alice, and I did a play of Alice. So at random, I opened to another page, and there were 4 handprints. One was André Breton, another was André Derain, the third was André, I've written down somewhere. It's not Malraux, it's like someone. Another of the Surrealists, all A's, and the fourth was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince. And they'd shown these handprints to some kind of expert without saying whose hands they belonged to. And under Exupéry's, it said that he was an artist with very powerful eyes who was a tamer of wild animals. So I thought, this is incredible, you know. And I looked back to see when the issue came out. It came out on the newsstands May 12th, 1934, and I was born during the day of May 11th, 1934. So, that's what started me on Saint-Exupéry and The Little Prince. Now, of course, today I think there's a very fascistic thing under The Little Prince. You know, I think there's a kind of, SS totalitarian sentimentality in there somewhere. You know, there's something, you know, that love of, well, that masculine love of a certain kind of oily muscle, you know what I mean? I can't quite put my finger on it, but I can just imagine some beautiful SS man loving the Little Prince. No, I don't know why, but there's something wrong with it. It stinks.
Well, didn't George tell me that you were going to do a play that was based on the Little Prince?
Well, what happened, Wally, was that fall, I was in New York, and I met this young Japanese Buddhist priest named Kozan, and I thought he was Puck from the Midsummer Night's Dream. You know, he had this beautiful, delicate smile. I thought he was the Little Prince. So, naturally, I decided to go off to the Sahara Desert to work on the Little Prince with 2 actors and this Japanese monk.
You did?
I mean, I was still in a very peculiar state at that time, Wally. You know, I would look in the rear view mirror of my car and see little birds flying out of my mouth. I remember always being exhausted in that period. I always felt weak, you know, I really didn't know what was going on with me. And I would just sit out there all alone in the country for days and do nothing but write in my diary. And I was always thinking about death.
But you went to the Sahara.
Oh, yes, we went off into the desert, and we rode through the desert in camels, and we rode, and we rode, and then at night we would walk out under that enormous sky and look at the stars. I just kept thinking about the same things that I was always thinking about at home, particularly about Chiquita. In fact, I thought about just about nothing but my marriage. And then I remember one incredibly dark night, being at an oasis, and there were palm trees moving in the wind, and I could hear Kozan singing far away in that beautiful bass voice, and I tried to follow his voice along the sand. See, I thought he had something to teach me, Wally. And sometimes I would meditate with him. Sometimes I'd go off and meditate by myself. You know, I would see images of Chiquita. Once, I actually saw her growing old and her hair turning gray in front of my eyes, and I would just wail and yell my lungs out there on the dunes. Anyway, the desert was pretty horrible. It was pretty cold. We were searching for something, but we couldn't tell if we were finding anything. You know, the once Kozan and I, we were sitting on a dune and we just ate sand. No, we weren't trying to be funny. I started, then he started. We just ate sand and threw up. That's how desperate we were. In other words, we didn't know why we were there. We didn't know what we were looking for. The entire thing seemed completely absurd, arid, and empty. It was like a last chance or something.
Huh. So what happened then?
Well, in those days, I went completely on impulse. So on impulse, I brought Kozan back to stay with us in New York after we got back from the Sahara, and he stayed for 6 months. And he really sort of took over the whole family in a way.
What do you mean?
Well, there was certainly a center missing in the house at the time. There certainly wasn't a father, because I was always thinking about going off to Tibet or doing God knows what. And so he taught the whole family to meditate, and he told them all about Asia and the East and his monastery and everything. He really captivated everybody with an incredible bag of tricks. He had literally developed himself, Wally, so that he could push on his fingers and rise off out of his chair. I mean, he could literally go like this, you know, push on his fingers and go into like a headstand and just hold himself there with 2 fingers. Or if Chiquita would suddenly get a little tension in her neck, well, he'd immediately have her down on the floor. He'd be walking up and down on her back doing these unbelievable massages, you know. And the children found him amazing. I mean, you know, we'd visit friends who had children, and immediately he'd be playing with these children in a way that, you know, we just can't do. I mean, those children just giggles about what this Japanese monk was doing in these holy robes. I mean, he was an acrobat, a ventriloquist, a magician, everything. You know, the amazing thing was that I don't think he had any interest in children whatsoever. None at all. I don't think he liked them. I mean, you know, when he stayed with us, in the first week, really, the kids were just googly-eyed over him. But then, a couple of weeks later, Chiquita and I could be out, and Marina could have flu or a temperature of 104, and he wouldn't even go in and say hello to her. But he was taking over more and more. I mean, his own habits had completely changed. You know, he started wearing these elegant Gucci shoes under his white monk's robes. He was eating huge amounts of food. I mean, he ate twice as much as Nicholas ate, you know? This tiny little Buddhist, when I first met him, you know, was eating a little bowl of milk, hot milk with rice, was now eating huge beef. It was just very strange. You know, and we tried working together, but really our work consisted mostly of my trying to do these incredibly painful prostrations that they do in the monastery, you know, so really, we hadn't been working very much. Anyway, we were out in the country, and we all went to Christmas Mass together. You know, he was all dressed up in his Buddhist finery. You know, it was one of those awful, dreary Catholic churches on Long Island where the priest talks about communism and birth control. And as I was sitting there in Mass, I was wondering, what in the world is going on? I mean, here I am, I'm a grown man, and there's this strange person living in the house, and I'm not working. I mean, you know, I was doing nothing but scribbling a little poetry in my diary. I can't get a job teaching anymore, and I don't know what I want to do. When all of a sudden, a huge creature appeared, looking at the congregation. It was about, I'd say, 6'8", something like that, you know, and it was half bull, half man, and its skin was blue, it had violets growing out of its eyelids and poppies growing out of its toenails, and it just stood there for the whole Mass. I mean, I could not make that creature disappear. You know, I thought, oh, well, you know, I'm just seeing this because I'm bored, you know, close. I could not make that creature go away. Okay, now, I didn't talk with people about it because they'd think I was weird, but I felt that this creature was somehow coming to comfort me, that somehow he was appearing to say, well, you may feel low, and you might not be able to create a play right now, but look what can come to you on Christmas Eve. Hang on, old friend. I may seem weird to you, but on these weird voyages, weird creatures appear. It's part of the journey. You're okay. Hang in there.
By the way, did you ever see that play, The Violets Are Blue?
No.
Oh, when you mentioned the violets, it reminded me of that. It was about people being strangled on a submarine. Well, so that was that was Christmas. What happened after that?
You really want to hear about all of this?
Yeah.
Well, around that time, I was beginning to think about going to India. And Kozan suddenly left one day, and I was beginning to get into a lot of very strange ideas around that time. Now, for example, I developed this, well, I got this idea, which it was very appealing to me at the time, you know, which was that I would have a flag, a large flag, and that wherever I worked, this flag would fly, or if we were outside, say, with a group, that the flag could be the thing that we lay on at night, and that somehow, between working on this flag, lying on this flag flying over us, that the flag would pick up vibrations of a kind that would still be in the flag when I brought it home. So I went down to meet this flag maker that I'd heard about, and, you know, there was this very straightforward-looking guy, you know, very sweet and really healthy-looking and everything, nice, big, blonde. You know, had a beautiful, clean loft down in the village with lovely, happy flags. And I was all into the Little Prince. I talked to him about the Little Prince, these adventures and everything, how I needed the flag and what the flag should be. And he seemed to really connect with it. So 2 weeks later, I came back. He showed me a flag that I thought was very odd, you know, because I'd expected something gentle and lyrical. There was something about this that was so powerful, it was almost overwhelming. And it did include the Tibetan swastika.
You put a swastika in your flag?
It was the Tibetan swastika, not the Nazi swastika. It's one of the most ancient Tibetan symbols. And it was just strange, you know? But I brought it home because my idea with this flag was that before I left for India, I wanted several people who were close to me to have this flag in the room for the night, to sleep with it, you know, and then in the morning to sew something into the flag. So I took the flag into Marina and I said, hey, look at this. What do you think of this? And she said, what is that? That's awful. I said, it's a flag. And she said, I don't like it, you know. And I said, oh, well, I kind of thought you might like to spend the night with it, you know. But she really thought the flag was awful. So then, Chiquita threw this party for me before I left for India, and the apartment was filled with guests. And at one point, Chiquita said, the flag, where's the flag? And I said, oh yeah, the flag. And I go and get the flag, and I open it up. Chiquita goes absolutely white and runs out of the room and vomits. So the party just comes to a halt and breaks up. And then the next day, I gave it to this young woman who'd been in my group in Poland, who was now in New York. And I didn't tell her anything about any of this. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she called me up and she said, I gotta come and see you right away. I thought, oh God. She came up and she said, I saw things around this flag. Now, I know you're stubborn and I know you want to take this thing with you, but if you'd follow my advice, you'd put it in a hole in the ground and burn it and cover it with earth, because the devil's in it. Well, I never took the flag with me. In fact, I gave it to her, and she had a ceremony with it 6 months later in France with some friends in which they did burn it.
It's really, really amazing. So, did you ever go to India?
Oh, yes. I went to India in the spring, Wally, and I came back home feeling all wrong. I mean, you know, I'd been to India, and I just felt like a tourist. I'd found nothing. So, I was spending the summer on Long Island with my family, and I heard about this community in Scotland called Findhorn, where people sang and talked and meditated with plants. And it was founded by several rather middle-class English and Scottish eccentrics, some of them intellectuals and some of them not. And I'd heard that they'd grown things in soil that supposedly nothing can grow in, because it's almost beach soil, and they'd they'd grown the largest cauliflowers in the world, and they're sort of cabbages, and they've grown trees that can't grow in the British Isles. So I went there. I mean, it is an amazing place, Wally. I mean, if there are insects bothering the plants, they will talk with the insects and, you know, make an agreement by which they'll set aside a special patch of vegetables just for the insects, and then the insects will leave the main part alone. Things like that. And everything they do beautifully. I mean, the buildings just shine. I mean, for instance, the icebox, the stove, the car, you know, they all have names. And since you wouldn't treat Helen, the icebox, with any less respect than you would Margaret, your wife, you know, you make sure that Helen is as clean as Margaret, or treated with equal respect. And when I was there, Wally, I remember being in the woods, and I would look at a leaf, and I would actually see that thing that is alive in that leaf. And then I remember just running through the woods as fast as I could with this incredible laugh coming out of me, and really being in that state, you know, where laughter and tears seem to merge. I mean, it absolutely blasted me open. When I came out of Findhorn, I was hallucinating nonstop. I was seeing clouds as creatures. The people on the airplane all had animals' faces. I mean, I was on a trip. You know, it was like being in a William Blake world suddenly. Things were exploding. So immediately, I went to Belgrade because I wanted to talk to Grotowski. Grotowski and I got together at midnight in my hotel room, and we drank instant coffee out of the top of my shaving cream, and we talked from midnight until 11 the next morning.
God, what did he say?
Nothing. I talked. He didn't say a word. And then, I guess really, the last big experience of this kind took place that fall. It was out on Montauk on Long Island, and there were only about 9 of us involved, mostly men. And we'd borrowed Dick Avedon's property out at Montauk, and the country out there is like Heathcliff country. It's absolutely wild. What we wanted to do was we wanted to take All Souls Eve, Halloween, and use it as a point of departure for something. So each one of us prepared some sort of event for the others, somehow in the spirit of All Souls Eve. But the biggest event was 3 of the people kept disappearing in the middle of the night each night, and we knew they were preparing something big, but we didn't know what. And midnight on Halloween, under a dark moon above these cliffs, we were all told to gather at the topmost cliff and that we'd be taken somewhere, and we did. And we waited, and it was very, very cold. And then the 3 of them, Helen, Bill, and Fred, showed up wearing white, you know, something they'd made out of sheets. Looked a little spooky, not funny. And they took us into the basement of this house that had burned down on the property. And in this ruined basement, they had set up a table with benches they'd made. And on this table, they had laid out paper, pencils, wine, and glasses. And we were all asked to sit at the table and to make out our last will and testament, you know, to think about and write down whatever our last words were to the world or to somebody we were very close to. And that's quite a task. I must have been there for about an hour and a half or so, maybe 2. And then one at a time, they would ask one of us to come with them, and I was one of the last. And they came for me, and they put me a blindfold on me, and they ran me through these fields, 2 people. And they'd found a kind of potting shed, you know, a kind of shed on the grounds, a little tiny room that had once had tools in it. And they took me down the steps into this basement, and the room was just filled with harsh white light. Then they told me to get undressed and give them all my valuables. Then they put me on a table and they sponged me down. Well, you know, I just started flashing on death camps and secret police. I don't know what happened to the other people, but I just started to cry uncontrollably. Then they got me to my feet and they took photographs of me naked. And then naked, again blindfolded, I was run through these forests and we came to a kind of tent made of sheets with sheets on the ground. And there were all these naked bodies huddling together for warmth against the cold. Must have been left there for about an hour. And then again, one by one at a time, we were let out. The blindfold was put on, and I felt myself being lowered onto something like a stretcher. And the stretcher was carried a long way, very slowly, through these forests. And then I felt myself being lowered into the ground. They had, in fact, dug 6 graves, 8 feet deep. And then I felt these pieces of wood being put on me. I mean, I cannot tell you, Wally, what I was going through. And then the stretcher was lowered into the grave, and then this wood was put on me, and then my valuables were put on me in my hands, and they'd taken, you know, a kind of sheet or canvas, and they'd stretched about this much above my head, and then they shoveled dirt into the grave, so that I really had the feeling of being buried alive. And after being in the grave for about half an hour, I mean, I didn't know how long I'd be in there. I was resurrected, lifted out of the grave, blindfold taken off, and run through these fields, and we came to a great circle of fire with music and hot wine, and everyone danced until dawn. And then, at dawn, to the best of our ability, we filled up the graves and went back to New York. And that was really the last big event. I mean, that was the end. You know, I began to realize I just didn't want to do these things anymore, you know? I felt sort of becalmed, you know, like that chapter in Moby Dick where the wind goes out of the sails. And then last winter, without thinking about it very much, I went to see this agent I know to tell him I was interested in directing plays again. Actually, he seemed a little surprised to see that Rip Van Winkle was still alive.
God, I didn't know they were so small.
Well, you know, frankly, I'm sort of repelled by the whole story, if you really want to know.
What?
Who did I think I was, you know? I mean, that's a story of some kind of spoiled princess. You know, who do I think I was, the Shah of Iran? You know, I really wonder if people such as myself are really not Albert Speer, Wally. You know? Hitler's architect, Albert Speer.
Huh?
No, I've been thinking a lot about him recently because I think I am Speer. And I think it's time that I was caught and tried the way he was.
What are you talking about?
Well, I mean, you know, he was a very cultivated man, an architect, an artist, you know, so he thought the ordinary rules of life didn't apply to him either. I mean, I really feel that everything I've done is horrific. Just horrific.
My God, but why?
You see, I've seen a lot of death in the last few years, Wally, and there's one thing that's for sure about death. You do it alone, you see. That seems quite certain, you see. That I've seen. That the people around your bed mean nothing. Your reviews mean nothing. Whatever it is, you do it alone. And so the question is, when I get on my deathbed, what kind of a person am I going to be? And I'm just very dubious about the kind of person who would have lived his life those last few years the way I did.
Well, why should you feel that way?
You see, I've had a very rough time in the last few months, Wally. 3 different people in my family were in the hospital at the same time. Then my mother died. Then Marina had something wrong with her back, and we were terribly worried about her, you know, so, I mean, I'm feeling very raw right now. I mean, I can't sleep. My nerves are shot. I mean, I'm affected by everything. You know, last week, I had this really nice director from Norway over for dinner. He's someone I've known for years and years, and he's somebody that I think I'm quite fond of. And I was sitting there just thinking that he was a pompous, defensive, conservative stuffed shirt who was only interested in the theater. You know, he was talking and talking. You know, his mother had been a famous Norwegian comedian. I realized he had said, "I remember my mother," at least 400 times during the evening, and he was telling story after story about his mother, you know. I'd heard these stories 20 times in the past. He was drinking this whole bottle of bourbon very quietly. His laugh was so horrible, you know. I could hear his laugh. The pain in that laugh, the hollowness, you know, what being that woman's son had done to him, you know. So at a certain point, I just had to ask him to leave nicely, you know. I told him I had to get up early the next morning because it was so horrible. It was just as if he had died in my living room. And then, you know, then I went into the bathroom and cried because I felt I'd lost a friend. And then after he'd gone, I turned the television on, and there was this guy who just won the something, you know, some sports event, some kind of great big check and some kind of huge silver bottle. And you know, he couldn't stuff the check in the bottle. He put the bottle in front of his nose and pretended it was his face. You know, he wasn't really listening to the guy who was interviewing him, but he was smiling malevolently at his friends. And I looked at that guy, and I thought, what a horrible, empty, manipulative rat. Then I thought, that guy is me. Then last night, actually, you know, it was our 20th wedding anniversary. I took Chiquita to see the show about Billie Holiday, and I looked at these show business people who know nothing about Billie Holiday. Nothing. You see, are really kind of, in a way, intellectual creeps. And I suddenly had this feeling. I mean, you know, I was just sitting there crying through most of the show. I suddenly had this feeling. I was just as creepy as they were. And then my whole life had been a sham. And I didn't have the guts to be Billie Holiday either. I mean...